Okay, Dr. Rodrigo Ceballos,
Hey.
originally from Laredo, Texas, now proud citizen of the state of Arizona. Do you live in Tucson?
Yes, sir. Living in Tucson, Arizona.
Good, my
Hello,
friend.
all the way from Tucson.
Good, my friend. Thank you for joining me this morning.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So, just briefly, what I'm trying to do with Border Speaks, it's one of my endless pursuits at trying to have a creative life. And sometimes they're good ideas, sometimes they're terrible ideas. So this is where we are today in the
That's
midst of
awesome.
one of these ideas. And um, the reason I asked you to join me this morning is because you were very integral in my development as a person. I met you, I think 99, 98, 99. I don't know if you recall, but we met at Lucinda Farouk's house. I think your parents, you were an adult, I was an adult. Your parents took you to a party. My parents took me to the same party. And
That's right. That's right. I remember. I
yeah,
totally remember.
and I think we just like became brothers like instantly. We just became
Like that.
brothers. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember, man. I remember. That was such a wonderful time in Laredo. That was really a wonderful time.
Yeah. Well, at that time in my life, I know my struggle has always been, maybe it's also been your struggle, but my struggle has always been that I think for a long time I felt a lot of pressure to try to conform to people's standards, especially back in those early years, because I wanted to be cool, I wanted to be popular, I wanted to be liked, and I didn't understand then that the more original and authentic you were, the cooler you were. I didn't see
Mm.
that. I didn't understand that. That's something that I didn't understand too much later. And when I met you, you were definitely someone who was on a journey to be authentic. And I think that was something that really spoke to me. And what I
Oh,
loved
wow.
about your journey there was that, you were, uh, had just moved back to Laredo, and I'll let you talk a little bit about that part of that time period. But you just moved back to Laredo after having been in Austin for a few years, studying acupuncture, Chinese medicine,
Mm.
Eastern religion. I think at that time you were even sort of following some Hinduism,
Mm.
and I guess it was a mix of stuff, right? But anyway, point being that when I met you, I said, okay, here's someone that speaks to me. And so what I'd like to kind of start off with is tell us a little bit about what you do now. And then I want to go back to that period and kind of work our way back to now.
Nice, nice. Yeah, back then, I had just completed acupuncture training, and um, yeah, now I work at the VA. It's certainly been a lot of years, which is um, it's wonderful to connect. Thank you for this opportunity and for having given me a call and checked in. We've had a very busy week, and I was looking forward to this. Um, the the work I do right now is still a continuation, a lot of what was going on back then as well. The acupuncture training that I received over in Austin. So I had been born and raised in Laredo, and had no idea about so much about Eastern traditions and Eastern philosophy. And I really give credit a lot to the time that I spent in Austin, as having been, going to like the metropolitan of Austin, right? I mean, granted, it's not an enormously huge city, but where we came from, Laredo, um, uh, is uh, is unlike any other place. And the more time I spend, the more time that passes, the more I realize how unique it is. Um, but one of the things that um, being so deeply embedded in the Mexican American culture, really more Mexican. I mean, I remember reading a news article not too long ago saying about how Laredo is one of the least diverse cities in the United States, because we're all Mexican. And the things that presented themselves to me in Austin, I remember as a kid in Laredo going to like a Chinese restaurant and being absolutely fascinated by the Chinese characteristics, right? The little Buddha statue at some Chinese buffet there. You go in and we take it for granted. You walk in and you think it's part of the decor, right, in the restaurant. And there's this little altar and there's a little thing, and they're like, oh, how quaint. But that means something, right, to that family. And the story of where that came from, like, fascinated me as a kid. And I felt very, very drawn towards images in restaurants of all places when I was really little, that really looked as if they were from somewhere else. And having that locked in my head, like this means something. This is something that I want to learn about. Like, my goodness, the world must be really big. How do you write? You've seen Chinese and you're like, you can't make sense of it using your regular like way that you learn things. So when I went to Austin and began to actually meet a greater variety of people, and then not to mention the educational resources, right? Went there for college, and started to try my best. I really, 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 really wanted to, more than anything else, be an astrophysicist. I mean, right, we're in the golden age of astrophysics right now. I mean, had I accomplished that, right, I would have been before the time of Hubble, right? Right now, we would have been at there would have been so many things that I could have been involved in, but I think I went a little too fast. I found myself in a class of relativistic astrophysical gas dynamics, right? So relativistic equations, take into account things going so fast that they're at the point of the speed of light, right? So then you throw in the equations for fluid dynamics, right? So like the Reynolds number of different fluids and viscosities and such. And so I was a freshman at the University of Texas at Austin there. And I decided I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to try this class. I thought it was all cool. And I went to see this graduate course in relativistic astrophysical gas dynamics. And I was so above my head, I had no idea how. I couldn't even, and I literally like felt very deflated after that class. I felt as if, wow, there's no way I'm ever going to be that good at mathematics. I'm going to have to slowly build. So I started constructing my course. We all have to make our course choices. And one of the course choices that was there was um, medical literature, actually, and medical linguistics was a class. So I took this class, and the medical terminology class was in the College of Humanities, where the professor gave the etymology and the root source origin of so many medical terms that we have. So you think of the term hepatitis or diabetes mellitus, and you think to yourself, oh, diabetes is, well, where did this come from, right? It has its roots in Greek and Roman culture. And this professor was an astonishingly accurately well-read historian and instead of just giving, well, it comes from the Romans. No, she would break down the etymology, and then not only that, but she went so far as to give extreme details of the whole medical culture and philosophy that was present from Aristotle, and before, and she went into Egyptian medicine, into the medicine of Galen, and of course, then some of the terms also then came into concepts such as, vitalism, the concepts, of medicine that's kind of like, we put it away, historically now. We say to ourselves the concept of the humors, right, in Greek and Egyptian medicine, the concept of the soul. And she went into very interesting description about how the dichotomy that occurred between the mind and spirit, the body and spirit, body and mind, right, as being something, the Cartesian split, as we often speak as being, as if that was like it is a very identifiable time to explain that, and it does help us. But that class just blew my mind. I mean, I was convinced that there was some deep truth that was still present inside of ancient literature that must make sense for the day. And of course, then I came across many other religious forms, right, that were there present inside of this one class. I
So
ended
hold
up.
on, let me ask you this.
Go
So
ahead.
you're taking the class, and did you know why you were drawn towards that? I mean, at that point, had you really even been interested in medicine, or was that sort of?
At that time, here, let's see, I left my spoon. Sorry.
It's okay, no worries.
I left my
No worries.
spoon
No
for
worries.
stirring my
Your
tea.
tea, yeah.
I wasn't sure about medicine at that time. You know, I actually did not want to be a doctor. I hated doctors. I was like, they smell like rubbing alcohol, and they stick you with needles. And my only memory of being a doctor as a kid, you know, was all the pain and suffering that you usually. The reason you see a doctor is because you're not feeling well.
Yeah.
And so you always, in your mind, you associate like feeling really terrible with seeing a doctor. So I was like, no, doctors are terrible. I don't want to be a
So then
doctor.
what
I
drew
want to
you?
be a scientist.
So what drew you to that class then? Because I mean, that seems like in the universe of classes, that I mean, like I
Well,
can tell you, I would have never taken that class. Yeah, I
here's the
would have only taken
problem.
that class if it was in my major.
Here's the problem is that I wanted to be a cool scientist. Like I really wanted to be a
Yeah.
mathematician. I wanted to be the next Stephen Hawking's, right?
Yeah.
But I'd take the math classes and I was not really good. But I
Yeah.
take biology, and biology always made sense to me.
Yeah.
Biology always clicked. Like I never had any confusion when it came to concepts in biology. So um, I thought to myself, well, if I take a class that has, you know, let me make myself feel better about this pursuit. You know, I'm going to take a class that I could probably understand. To be honest, you know, I have a lot of medicine in my family, and I think that I took it for granted. I have like a very I think I thought to myself, you know, I didn't need to even think about medicine because it's almost as if it's already part of my nature. It's almost like I didn't want to do something that I knew that I could do. Like I know that sounds like kind of like you're
No,
like
no, no. It makes
no, but
sense. No, it makes sense.
it just made sense in my family because I had been surrounded by it. You know, my uncle Joaquin Ceballos, who's a physician, my uncle Juan Ramirez, who's a physician in Nuevo Laredo, you know, they, I grew up walking through their clinics and looking at their equipment, and you know, when we would go to their house to go visit my aunts and uncles, you know, the cousins would be playing, and I would reach onto their bookshelf and I would pull out, you know, their books on anatomy. My uncle Juan Ramirez's library. I mean, I think maybe that's why I like my books here, because he had these books. And I remember being able to get his book on anatomy and reading terms that I always wanted to understand. Anyway, jumping forward again, the time in Austin then allowed me to see and meet philosophies that were not present in Laredo. And in particular, I must say that there was a period of time where the classes got really challenging, and I decided I did not do so well in one semester. I didn't fail out, but I was like not A's, right? And that was enough for me to feel like, whoa, this is, I mean, it's in the big leagues now. I'm like so I took a lighter course the next semester and kept working part-time, and decided to just start looking for things that interested me. And you know the Perry Castaneda Library, you know, the PCL, they're on University of Texas campus. It's a huge, enormous library that has wonderful stacks. So I would walk over to the library and basically just wander the halls, right? Going up and down the stacks, just looking, the same way you go to, like, sometimes I really have to give thanks to my mom, who would take us, the one of the best memories I have is actually the times that she was working part-time over at Laredo Junior College, right? What, LJC, I don't know what it's called now. It has a
Laredo College.
Laredo College, yeah. So LJC back in the day.
Yeah, I always
Uh,
call it LJC too.
I can't. I still love that courtyard, the little area,
Yeah.
that right there in the middle. So beautiful, the architecture of that area. Because I went there small. Like, even when I go now, I still look at it and it still looks big to me. It's really,
Well,
it's
I
really
lived
cool.
on the campus.
Oh yeah.
I lived on the campus for 2 years with my parents. So
Oh.
about 2 months ago, I guess maybe in January, we went to the Laredo College board meeting because we were advocating for them to not sign the right of entry letters for the border wall.
Mm.
And so I went up to go present and to speak. And I said, when I come onto this campus, I feel like I'm literally coming to my own home because I lived
Oh
here. I
wow.
actually lived here. My
Were you
father
in
has
one of
been
those
there
cool
for 40
houses?
years. Yeah.
Were you in one of those cool houses that had
No,
the
it wasn't the super.
porches?
It wasn't. It did have a porch, but it wasn't the 2 stories. It was. It wasn't the officers' barracks. It was.
Oh,
It
that's what it
was. It was
was.
like
Yeah.
the non-commissioned officers'
Maybe
barracks or homes.
you stick
But
con eso.
anyway. So point being that you remember being back down there at LJC in the courtyard.
Yeah, man. I remember meeting your dad there. The first when I was in. I mean, uh, I remember distinctly for both good and bad reasons, right? The good reason was, it was I was very proud to be in his class, but I had this terrible habit. I had purchased this ring, and I was spinning it on the desk, and it was so loud, and I was clueless about it. I mean, I must have been like, I was 17, 16 years old, and I was in your dad's class, and he was just like, comes up to me and he just like puts his hand on the ring, and he was just like, please, like, stop that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I look up and I was like, suddenly, so I'll never forget that moment
Yeah.
that he, you know great guy,
Yeah,
your dad.
yes. But
Anyway,
I want to touch back on something you were saying though. You were talking
yes.
about that you didn't want to be a doctor, and it's because you felt like it was something that you could already do, and I can kind of relate to that in this way, that my family, we all have an interest in writing. My dad's a writer. My mother is a writer too. My sister is a writer as well, and I always felt like I had to distinguish myself from my family
Mm,
and do something different, And so I think when I decided to be a lawyer, part of it was I realized, look, you have the skill set for this, but it doesn't mean that that you can't later do art or be a writer or do something in the creative field. And I realized too, like, I guess part of my decision to go to law school was realizing that I really didn't know what to write about. I didn't really have enough experience in anything
mm.
to really have something to tell a story about. So I can understand what you're saying. Like, you had this idea of where you wanted to be a doctor, maybe, well, you wanted to be in the sciences. You wanted to be in the sciences. You wanted to do something unique to yourself and to your family. But then it sounds like the journey took you back to that medicine, but now you had a new twist on it. Like, in other words, it wasn't going to be a traditional doctor.
Yeah,
Is that right?
yeah, absolutely. I mean, um, our roots always pull us back, right? Our roots always end up, the more we grow, the more we pull on them to sustain us. And the concept of wanting to do good in the world, wanting to do something, is certainly an indelible concept that comes from um, my family, being raised with that feeling that being of service to others is essential, right? It's a definitely a very Catholic concept, very, very um, deep in the Catholic faith, and the the desire to want to distinguish yourself other than your family, right? The sense of differentiation, the desire to have your own identity certainly drove me in the direction of wanting to pursue things that would probably be more be at another level. But then, you know, you find yourself having challenges with being able to get to some world that you have no connection to, right? I had nobody in my family who was doing astrophysics, right? There's no mentoring in that particular direction, and what I found during that time that I was taking more breaks and exploring books, and I'm going to try to speed things up so that I don't take replay my entire life here, but suffice it to say that in those books I found something that had always interested me. I'm going to go back to in time for a moment. In United High School, when I was there was their library was quite nice. And again, just to give, I had missed we got sidetracked on LJC. I knew that's what I was talking about. LJC, my mom used to work there also part-time in the evenings, and as kind of a modified form of childcare. She would drop us off at the library and just be like, just don't leave the building. She would, you know, and we were like, okay. And so for us, it was a super treat, you know, she would let us loose in the library. And as long as we were like, we could wander, we could, I was like, can I pick out any book? She's like, any book you want, you can pick it out and you could read it. And I was just like, what if it's a book that I don't really understand? And, you know, like, I'd feel like all awesome because I'd pick up a book of mathematics that'd be like for high schoolers. And I'd be like, pretending as if I understood. I'd be looking through it. And I'd tell my brother, I'd be like, I'm reading high school mathematics. You see this book? You know, I'd be like all trying to, you know,
Yeah.
and we would look for different things. And so I love libraries. I absolutely adore getting a chance to walk through and then just see what's on the shelves. And so I did that over in the University of Texas. And I came across a section that had some more books on something that I had only found one book on in the library over at United High School. And they had this one old tattered copy of a book called Zen Flesh, Zen Bones by Suzuki Roshi. And this book is like, if you if you go and you look at and you analyze like you ask all of the modern American Zen masters here who are alive and teaching in Zen Zen centers around America. Zen Flesh, Zen Bones was a sea change, right? It was a huge influence in making Zen Buddhist practice accessible to the Western mind. And it's a very, very challenging philosophy and way of looking at things, so different from, you know, Western Catholicism, you know, and you know, the Catholic upbringing that I had. So theologically, you know, it had such a, I could make sense of it, right? Zen is, I mean, that's the point of Zen. But the areas that I found over in this Perry Castaneda library, there was a whole area of Eastern religious studies. And so I started reading more and more and more and more and more and more and more, and I devoured whole sections, right? Trying to get a sense of what was going on. And the more I read, the more I realized that there really is a whole lot more to these things than I realized. And not only in the sense of like, and what I had found was um, that there was very many different kinds of Buddhism, right? There's not just Zen Buddhism. There is not just, there are many. And
What spoke to you about it? What was it in that and what you were reading? Because, you know, for someone, I mean, if you're anything like I am, when I when I when I start to consume something, and then I look for new books and more books and, you know, different points of views of the same topic or similar topic, it's usually because it's showing me something or explaining something to me that either I was looking for or that I needed to read. So what was it about what you were reading that spoke to you, that you found it so interesting?
I think I had grown up with the idea that Catholicism and Laredoan culture was the way the entire planet was. I know that seems odd, but as a little child, right, as a child, from the mind of a child, you think, um, and the concepts of um, faith in creation, 7 days, Noah's Ark, the Garden of Eden, the Ten Commandments, um, these mythologies, right, that we have that are um, deeply embedded into the theology of Catholic faith, were not just in my mind uh, stories, right? They were realities. They were in my head, in the way that I saw the world, that which made the difference between right and wrong and meaning in the world was to be followed from these particular um, truths. And the West, I have to give credit to the simultaneity of the phenomena of scientific education, which led us to analyze, and the scientific method, right? You make a hypothesis, you make your test, you look at your results, etc. Many of what I was, many of the truths that I was learning about didn't seem to hold up. I was having a hard time being a good Catholic. It didn't make a lot of sense to me in terms of the incongruence between this theology and what seems to be happening in the world, right? What actually seems to be is that there were not a lot of answers coming from the church for finding solutions to what I wanted to do with my life, or what I was seeing in terms of phenomena. Um, nowadays, now I realize that that's because that's not what the church was for. So to kind of come full circle, like I'm realizing Catholic faith, of course, it's a different role, but in my mind, it having been the end all be all in terms of how I was told or how I was raised, that it all comes back to this. I was not finding complete explanation of the nature of the mind, the nature of the soul. There was missing pieces, and it was painful to not have like a complete. There's like a sense inside, like that just doesn't feel as if the system is coherent. And this desire to have like a coherent way of being was driven by seeing people who seemingly did have a coherent sense of meaning, right? Martin Luther King, Mahatma Gandhi, who influenced so much change in the world and did so much good, often would cite the words of the Buddha as having been one of their driving inspirations for nonviolence, right? So when I read Gandhi and I followed closely what it was that was giving him so much strength to be able to overthrow an entire empire, right? I was like blown away by the fact that there is a whole nother way of fortifying the spirit, right? To give meaning to life, to actually give you strength to be able to do things. Or my cat is calling me. Yes, I'm right here. So um, the the fact that so many people were getting so much that there was so much more history that was not European centric, that was not Catholic centric. We as I learned more, I started seeing, it's kind of like like a reproduction of the Galilean revolution, right? I started realizing, oh my God, the Earth is not the center of the universe. You know, like, oh my God, Laredo is not the center of the universe. You know,
I love that. That's
Catholic,
great.
Catholicism. You know, and we go
Yeah.
through. It's like a in biology we have this concept of an embryology. You know, as if you look at the embryo of any mammalian species, you'll see that it almost reproduces the appearance of those life forms that it evolved from, right? And it was happening to me. I was going through these little mini revolutions going in the church, you know, as it becomes, you know, and then the Copernican revolution, and realizing, oh my God, now the heliocentric model in my head, and then we have this discoveries, right? We of the concept of galaxies and of the Big Bang and of you know relativity. So this all started really making me have a lot of doubt in the European you know way of seeing things as being monolithic, or the Catholic approach as being monolithic and unique in its ownership of the soul and spirit, right? And I always had this like uh, gut feeling of pain that when we'd have like explanations of uh, um, heathens, pagans, right? The concept of cultures and societies that had these extraordinarily complex philosophies, but because they weren't Catholic, they're probably going to not be fortunate enough to be let into the gates of heaven.
Mhm.
And this was painful. I mean, honestly, I did not feel like there was, it just didn't make sense. Now, I mean, this is, again, I'm saying from where I was as opposed to where I am now. Now I know very different. I have a very different, so I'm not like, for those, my Catholic family who's going to see this, I know that they're going to be like, así no es, eso es no lo que, you know, like, ¿por
Yeah.
qué no estás diciendo tan mal? Los
Yeah.
católicos no
Yeah.
somos
Yeah.
así,
Yeah.
you know,
Right.
o sea, no, 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 o
And
sea,
is that a very
yeah,
Mexican American cultural thing to do, to sort of you have a view that's different from the regular views of your family or your friends, and you gotta you can't feel comfortable to fully criticize it because you know you'll be criticized for criticizing it, right?
yeah,
That's a Catholic guilt or something. Yeah. Well,
yeah, yeah,
let me say this. I think I had a different journey from you. Uh, I did not grow up Catholic. I mean, my parents are Catholic. They were baptized Catholic. On my mom's side of the family, they were very religious. But by the time my parents decided to have their family, you know, they were not practicing Catholics at all. And so I did not grow up with a worldview like the one you had when you left Laredo to go to Austin. And so I don't think I had the experience of finding out that everything that I had taken to be true was now being challenged in a fundamental way, not only in how I was experiencing the world, but then when I was looking for answers, finding that the answers weren't there. For me, my journey was more like I I didn't really have as much of a solid identity of who I was when I think when I met you. I think when I met you, I was still very I think I experienced the world in a very reactive way, in that I looked around and I just sort of said, okay, how am I going to fit into all of this? And and it was a very immature worldview. When then I meet you and you are, you know, talking about Hinduism, about Buddhism, you know, and then we lived together for some time, and you know, you used acupuncture one evening to cure my insomnia. I had horrible insomnia
oh yeah, I remember
for
that.
many
That's right.
years, and then in one treatment, you know, I never had insomnia again. I mean, yeah, I've had, you know, nights that every once in a while you got
Sure,
something to
sure.
do the next day, you worried, but in terms of chronic insomnia, or you cured it with that one treatment. I remember, you know, and so it was just like, what is this world? that
Mm.
Rodrigo is talking about and that he knows. And I think that's when I began to question kind of, well, do I even know anything or do I feel anything? And then let me just say this because I want to hear what you have to say.
Sure,
And then
sure.
coupled with that, through you, I met Chito Vela, who
Yeah,
was
man.
also my brother. And you two are my two Spaniard friends. I call you both Hernan Cortés. Uh,
Hijos.
I'm the subjugated,
Yeah.
and so then I meet Chito through you, and Chito is just this very brilliant guy who was a city manager for some colonia in
Yeah,
South
man. Wasn't that
Texas.
amazing?
Yeah, yeah.
And he was so young, like
Yeah, and cool and political thinker.
chinga.
And so think about that for a second, dude. Like, I think in the course of a year, like, I meet you, we become brothers, we start to live together. Then I meet Chito. I mean, you guys were very influential in my development and begin to take myself seriously as a person. But what I want to say is this: is that so when I arrive at studying Zen Buddhism and Buddhism and Hinduism and things like that, partly through you, partly through my mother, what I find was that what drew me to it was finding time and time again that what I thought about myself and what I thought about the world in terms of my everyday thinking, in terms of my habitual thinking, was wrong. And that I suffered moments of pain or moments of unhappiness because of that habitual thinking.
Mm.
And it's when I began to say, you know what, maybe there's something wrong with the way that you're thinking, like at a day-to-day basis, not the big picture conceptual understanding of the universe as much as just the basics of the mind. And so when I
Mm.
started to read a lot about the Zen Buddhist and Buddhism, I mean, they take you right to that. I mean, that's like going right to the part of the library where it's going to talk about why your mind works the way it works.
Mm.
You know what I'm saying? And so that was the first moment that I think I felt real peace emotionally, spiritually, which is when I said, you know what? The problem is not the world and the problem is not me. The problem is the way I see
Mm.
the world,
Mm.
and that's what really drew me to it.
That's profound. When we met, I had already had the benefit of having had. Um, so when we met, we're fast forwarding the time that I'm talking to you about occurred 4, 5, 6 years before we met. When I returned to Laredo, I had already gone through the university and had gone through the library, had discovered Buddhism, had then decided that I needed to make some form of actualization of the Buddhist practices and philosophies into something actual that I could do for people. And what I discovered was that there was a very specific form of intact cultural uh, uh, embodiment of Buddhist philosophy into an actual practice in the world through their medical system. Tibetan Buddhist medical system is an extraordinarily valuable gem of humanity that needs to be preserved. The Tibetan Buddhist medical system has so much of the roots of the philosophies of the ancient world in a way that is unlike any other system. It's so thoroughly complete. And I had wanted to practice it. Tibetan Buddhist medical system arises from the concepts not just of Buddhism, but also those concepts of the Indian subcontinent. So when we think about Hinduism and we think about yoga and we think about pranayama and we think about the ideas of nonviolence and these concepts, they're actually arising from deeper understandings of the body as having an energetic component to it that actually gives rise to the mind-body complex. And that we can begin to understand the suffering in our lives in context of this harmony or disequilibrium of energies inside of our body. Now, the term energies, of course, let's just refer to them in terms of homeostasis, in terms of like the regular physiological functioning. We will feel better. And we know this now, right? These are now like self-evident truths in terms of modern psychology. That many of these ancient things are proving themselves to be true now, that if there is structural stability inside of the body, many times we have psychological health, right? We have people who, um, so the idea that you're describing there, I had been keyed into as having this, there is not so much of this internal external harmony that happens in Catholic tradition. And so when I found that within the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, I then wanted to study Tibetan Buddhist medicine. It was like, oh my God, if only I could. But there was no Tibetan Buddhist medical college or degree or practice in the United States. But it happened to be that in Austin in 1991 was exactly when the 1992, excuse me, was the first year that that Texas began allowing traditional Chinese medicine to be practiced in the state. And they began actually allowing licenses to be created for what was then at that time what is known as licensed acupuncturist. And I was fortunate in that there was a school that was opened, and I got to be part of the inaugural class. So me and a group of another 30 people is signed up to this university that now is called the Academy of Oriental Medicine in Austin, AOMA. Now, I believe now it's called AOMA School of Graduate Integrative Medicine, Graduate School of Integrative Medicine. I don't forget what its full name is now, but it's still, the idea being that Tibetan Buddhist medicine is a combination of both Indian and Chinese medicine. I couldn't practice Tibetan medicine. I couldn't practice Indian medicine because there wasn't very good Ayurveda schools where I was, but there was traditional acupuncture school. So I thought to myself, if I learn acupuncture, eventually I'll learn Ayurveda. Eventually I can become Tibetan Buddhist medicine, eventually. So by the time I met you, I had already completed the master's degree in traditional Chinese medical studies, which allowed me to get the license to become a licensed acupuncturist to perform acupuncture. I had learned Tai Chi, I had learned meditation and Qigong. I had learned complex herbalism through many professors there. So when I had returned to Laredo, it was with the intent of being able. Then the smack reality of economics happened to me when I was in Austin. In that, when I finished my acupuncture training and decided to try to start my own acupuncture clinic, I did not have the capital, to actually have a nice clinic, right? All I had invested so much time on making sure that I had an understanding at the level of my heart of what it meant to be a healer, of what it meant to actually transform and learn. So, I mean, I had learned about, I have like the little acupuncture models I was going to show you, but, about how our energy, our external goes into our internal, and by balancing them, you can actually heal many, many illnesses, right? And so, um, but then the financial reality happened in Austin. The market was saturated, as they would say, because I went into school with 30 other students. Well, 30 other acupuncturists were suddenly in the community, right? So we all graduated at similar times, and we all set up our little clinics, and there was also already other clinics that had been well established. And acupuncture is a tertiary, right, or quaternary. It's like it's a luxury. It's not a primary source of medicine for most Americans.
Mhm.
It's for those who can afford it to have a little bit of extra health care at that time.
Mhm.
And so the number of patients that are available that have expendable income to be able to go was few and far between, right? And so I said, oh my goodness, okay, what am I going to do now? I should go where people need what I can do. And that's when I realized I should go home. I should go back to Laredo. Every time I'd come home, because I would, Austin and Laredo is not too far. So you're always traveling back and forth for Christmas, for baptism, for a wedding, you're always going back and forth, go see family, go see friends. every time while I was in acupuncture school that I would show up in Laredo, my mom would be like, ay, ¿sabes qué? Que tu prima esto y lo otro. Ay, ¿sabes qué? Que le duele la espalda. Oye, Rodrigo, dime de lo que, ¿qué debo de hacer? Porque el azúcar que tengo, ¿qué voy a, you know, like everybody would always ask me
Yeah.
stuff, and I was just,
Yeah.
you know, trying to answer their questions, and it was
Yeah.
wonderful. You know, I would
Yeah.
always have these challenges in my head about trying to figure out, okay, well, how can I help? And I'd be like, okay, I'm going to go back to Austin. And then I'd get to Austin, and then I'd be still in contact with my mom about trying to figure out what we're going to do for, you know, my family. So then I realized I want to, I want to help them. I want to go, you know, I can make a difference. You know, I can actually get rid of, you know, such and such back pain of this other, I can do all these things for them. Why don't I go back? Okay. So I moved back, and I started my clinic and began seeing patients, and had a wonderful, wonderful time. So by that time that we met, I had already been practicing what I had learned from the traditional Chinese medical, learning about how to do Tai Chi, how to be able to do calming breath, how to do stretches. I had already learned about nutrition. I had already learned about um, uh, um, uh, Buddhist meditation practices. I had been also exposed to the Hindu practices, right? So I had met Amaji, right, the Srimata Amritananda Mahima, and from Kerala. And she had come through Dallas, and I had gone to meet her. So I had learned about Hinduism, and I had while I was finishing school for acupuncture, I was living with a group of Indians from Tamil Nadu, and incredible guys. I mean, that they were PhD students there at the University of Texas, and they had they meditated every day. We prayed and sang. Like the weekends were spent like chanting and praying, and it was wonderful because by that time I had stopped drinking, and I wasn't, you know, hanging out and partying with a bunch of my Laredo friends anymore, and I was really boring, right? I mean, I was this guy who didn't want to go. No, I don't really find any interest in going to you know, see what I can score on 6th Street. I was like, that was just what, you know, it had no draw to me.
Mm.
So therefore, a lot of my friends, I became kind of, I didn't have a lot of commonality with many of the people that I grew up with, and so these Indian dudes, you know, were actually like doing what I wanted to do, which was to meditate and to chant and to pray and we'd sit around and we would. Uh, um, One of the guys that I lived with actually ended up becoming the dean of the College of Engineering over in Amma's University in Kerala,
Wow.
Balakrishnan.
Are you still in
I forget
contact with him?
his last name. Yeah, no, I haven't talked to him in a long. It's been a long time. I have a friend who still sees him, Dr. Tony Stupski over in Portland. He's still friends with him. He saw him a few years ago. But Bala had this great thing where um, he would quote he would make he would read a passage from a particular philosopher, right? And he would quiz me to see if I can identify who it was. You know, he'd read such and such, and I'd be like, oh, that's Sri Aurobindo, you know. And then he'd read another passage, and I'd be like, oh, that's, you know, Ramana Maharshi. Like clearly Ramana Maharshi's writing. That could only be him. And then he'd be like, oh, very good. Then you'd read another, oh, that's clearly Nisargadatta. You know, he's like, oh, very good. You know, so he was educating me about how to identify all the different passages. And I read I read the Ramayana, I read the Mahabharata, I read the Bhagavad Gita, you know, I read the Upanishads, I read all of the, you know, the stuff that was also had a chance to read, you know, Tao Te Ching, all of the classic traditional Chinese texts and Chinese medical philosophy. Anyway, so um, when I finally moved back to Laredo, it was with this intention to be able to provide high quality acupuncture for my patients. And what ended up happening in Laredo was that in Austin, you already had many people who were taken care of as far as their like medical care, and they'd go to acupuncture for an extra level of care. In Laredo, we have a lot of it's a medically underserved area, right? We don't have enough medical care, primary medical care to cover the people. So people I had some clients who were coming to me with what would be appropriate concerns: low back pain, insomnia, headaches, migraines, etc. But I had a whole lot of them actually coming to me with conditions that they should have had treated by primary care, right? I had people coming with uh, uh, metastatic cancers, with kidney failure, with complications from lupus nephropathy, pneumonias. I had people coming in, knocking on my door in the middle of the night for treatments for stroke symptoms, right? They were coming to me as if I was like
Wow.
an emergency room doctor.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, and as if I was primary care. And so I also did not want to give up on my patients who I saw, because I believed that acupuncture and the philosophies that I had learned would be of benefit to them. But I found that many of them were taking medications, lists of medications, right, that I had no idea. Now, in traditional Chinese medicine, we learn about things that are, herbs that are given terminologies in terms of their utilization that are couched inside of traditional Chinese medical forms. So, for example, an herb is considered hot or cold. It rises, it falls. We don't learn their chemistry. We don't learn like, oh, this one is an anti-inflammatory, or this one happens to be an anti-hypertensive. We don't learn like that.
Hmm.
And so when a person comes in with medications that have like these effects, I didn't know how to combine them with their herbal formulas to be
Right.
able to make sure that I didn't hurt them or do something. So then that's when I decided that it's probably reasonable to begin to learn more about Western biomedical approaches, and that's exactly when we met. We actually were I and the reason I had closed down my clinic, where I had been living on my own, and I had all my things, and it became extraordinarily difficult to put up also with people knocking on my door, because I was living in the clinic, right? And the
Hmm.
front
Hmm.
part of the
Hmm.
house was the clinic, the back
Yeah, I
part of the house
remember.
was where I lived.
Yeah.
And when I wanted to move out, we were talking, and I found out like, oh yeah, your family has this house, and you needed someone to pay rent too. I was like, hey, like, hey man, like, can I, go move in? They were like, hey, yeah, sure, and so I helped you, you helped me. It
Yeah.
was wonderful, and
Yeah.
it was. I always give thanks to your parents for having been welcomed me into that part of the house.
They were so grateful to have you. I mean,
Oh man,
you
it
know.
was so cool. You all
And I
were
think I
such a
think
stabilizing force in my life. It was
yeah, I
wonderful.
think I only lived there for like 9 months, right? And then I left. And then I think
Hmm.
you stayed in that house for another year or so, right?
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, so let me ask you this question, because I want to kind of fast forward a little bit.
absolutely.
So you and I live together. Then I leave Laredo to go to law school. No, I leave Laredo to move to San Antonio,
Uh-huh.
and I teach in San Antonio for a year. Then, as I'm leaving that year, because after before the end of that year in San Antonio, I got accepted to law school at UT, and so I was moving to Austin. And I think you moved to San Antonio because you had gotten accepted to was it the University of Texas Health Science Center in San Antonio,
Hmm. Hmm.
and so then you moved to San Antonio right as I'm leaving San Antonio.
I
Then I moved
know.
to then I moved to Austin, and I go to law school for 3 years. And then you go to while you're in medical school. Then as I'm leaving Austin, Then as I'm leaving Austin, you are moving to Austin to do your residency, right? Then I move from Austin to El Paso, and so I'm there for a few years while you're doing your residency in Austin. And then as I'm leaving El Paso, coming back to Laredo, you moved to El Paso, and you really is when you begin to work as a doctor. And I think that's when you began. I know you may have. I know you worked at some places, kind of leading. Like you didn't initially work for the VA when you first moved to El Paso, but eventually you ended up at the VA. So I want to talk about that. I want to talk about your work at the VA because I was very struck
Sure.
by our conversations from that time period when you began to tell me about how you were treating patients who had been in conflict zones, recovering from from injuries and traumas in conflict zones, and that you were using what you had learned from the Eastern medication or the Buddhist medical tradition with what you had learned from the Western medical tradition. And I wanted you to talk a little bit about when you had the insight to do that. What exactly did you do? What were some of the things that you did? And what were some of the results? And what was the reaction of the VA system to that work that you were doing in El
Mm.
Paso?
You know, I forgot that that we had that track as far as I was following you across Texas, man.
Yeah,
You were a
yeah,
trailblazer. It's like
yeah.
trying
And
to
then you went
catch
to
up.
Arizona. Now I can't do anything about it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Now it totally diverged, but
Totally diverged.
yeah, the 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 connection to acupuncture and what I had learned from that never left, right? It's never not been part of me. And I had learned Chinese acupuncture and these concepts of holism as far as being intrinsic to what actually gives rise to health first. And so when I went to medical school, I still had that perspective, even when I was in the hospital with patients who had various different presentations. My thought pattern still automatically thought in terms of like nutrition, movement, um, psychological health. All of these things are profiles that need to be taken into account to make the person healthy, right? And so the concept of that they should be eating well, that they should be thinking well, that they should be moving well, as part and parcel as to how they've gotten to where they are as far as illness. So when I got to El Paso, the first job that I got was working with the Texas Tech University Health Science Center there at the Paul L. Foster School of Medicine, the Department of Family Medicine, and what they were doing there was a traditional, family medicine residency, but they had respect for the concepts of what it was that I had learned before, in that it was beginning to be appreciated as a form of medicine called integrative medicine, right? So the integrative medicine is the concept, or is the terminology that's used nowadays to describe all of these schools of thought that are being used as extra forms of practice to help with the treatment of illness. It used to be called complementary and alternative medicine. Integrative medicine is kind of a catch-all phrase now. Um, and medical schools throughout the country were beginning to increase the interest in integrative medicine in the curriculum for their medical students. And they needed someone who actually had that as a background, who knew it well enough, not just an interest, but actual training. And so I fulfilled that for them. And they were it was a wonderful time working with residents and medical students, educating them about, acupuncture, and showing them about, like, well, this is a very easy treatment that you can do and such and such. And I was fortunate enough to be asked to participate in the creation of a grant for medical students to learn about concepts of integrative medicine through the uh, through the department. And uh, part of the grant was going to involve getting the actual didactics, right, to be able to construct. And so the curriculum that I was using was drawing from information from the Consortium of Academic Health Centers for Integrative Medicine, the one that's actually started here at University of Arizona, here in Tucson, Arizona, with Dr. Andrew Weil. So that whole Dr. Andrew Weil's influence on all of this. It's really cool that I'm in Tucson now. Like it's like the 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 inspiration that I got from his work, is substantial, in terms of the fact that he was one of the first people who would then take these concepts and translate them into Western medical terms. So I used his information, and I used a lot of the other things that had been coming up to try to be able to make something that would be digestible by medical students. When we were trying to find the um, sites to be able to actually have medical students observe the treatments that were being done, I was going throughout the El Paso community trying to find chiropractors, massage therapists, herbalists, Tai Chi practitioners, meditation instructors, acupuncturists, etc., who were going to be of a sufficient training and caliber to be able to send medical students to be able to actually have them study with these people. Now, when you're talking about medical education, you're talking that the students, medical students, are going to be they need to have someone who is credentialed, whose offices are going to be licensed, etc. And so the criteria for finding someone who's actually um, bona fide, as you would say, to have a medical student actually learn from this individual, so that what they're learning jives with what would we consider actually verifiable medical information, right? So integrative medicine in general, unfortunately, is filled with a lot of, it's a very um, very inhomogeneous field, right? It's very heterogeneous. There's extraordinarily lots of differences, right? You get two acupuncturists, they sometimes don't agree about each other, with each other about the treatment of a particular condition, or two chiropractors, et cetera, or naturopaths. You give them a single patient, and both of them will have a different opinion about how you treat them. One may have this opinion about, this or that. Anyway, so to try to find all of them together in a coherent format was very challenging in the El Paso community. I came across one of my neighbors who was a good friend of mine, who is a trained hypnotherapist, Miguel Bonilla. I spoke with him at length, and he told me about a program that was occurring over at Fort Bliss, which is the largest, the base that's there in
The
El
Army
Paso,
base.
yeah,
Yeah.
the Army base there. That there was actually the beginnings of an initiative in the Army base to begin to bring integrative medicine into the Army, right, into the management of the soldiers, which was fascinating at that time. And so I went over to speak with them to ask them if they would be willing to be a site that would host the medical students from the department, from family medicine, to help have them learn about integrative medicine concepts. They said to me, well, we actually are looking for, we're about to start the program. The program doesn't exist entirely right now, and we need someone you're training who, as a medical doctor, as an MD, and as an integrative medicine specialist, you may be able to help us. Would you want to come on board?
Isn't that
I,
crazy? Isn't that crazy that had you moved to El Paso 1 year before, 2 years before, that might not have been a door or that was
it's true.
open? Had you moved there 2 years later, that might not have been a door that was
Yeah.
open. You moved to El Paso right in that moment.
Yeah.
Isn't that, to me, that's fascinating.
It really, and it was an incredible opportunity. It really was. Unique timing. The program that I got to participate in was one of a kind. It actually had not occurred in the Department of Defense quite to that nature. There had already been a lot of interest in the Department of Defense for integrating acupuncture and other concepts of integrative medicine into the care of soldiers, simply because the data for the effectiveness was substantial by that point. So it's not something that was actually created from where I came from. It had already been like this long, standing on the shoulders of giants, as they say. A lot of work had already been done by people in trying to find solutions to problems that we didn't seem to have good answers for. Um, when you look at the number of soldiers that have PTSD, I think the term post-traumatic stress disorder has now made its way into the popular nomenclature based upon the number of soldiers that we have now been made aware of that are having these problems, right? The nature of chronic pain, of traumatic brain injury due to the ongoing, conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq. We're having soldiers that are returning with wounds that are no longer uh, um, able to be treated easily with the Western paradigm or conventional medical
Mhm.
paradigms.
What is
And
PT?
so
Let me ask you, so what is PTSD? I mean, I know,
post-traumatic stress
yeah,
disorder.
yeah, and I know a lot of people are probably familiar with the term,
Sure,
but
sure,
what, like, in just very basic, non-professional terms,
sure.
what is the range of what PTSD is, and also what were the treatments that you put together to try to help it?
Sure. So post-traumatic stress disorder is a psychological reaction that, or classically is considered a psychological reaction, or a psychiatric condition that is a response to a traumatic event of some kind, in which a person becomes, there are many different symptoms that occur, and the kind of trauma that a person is exposed to, um, in the beginning of the discovery of, or the terminology of it, had been seen mostly in soldiers. So we used to use the term like shell shocked, like terms for soldiers who were coming back from World War I, World War II, the Vietnam War. The term the 1,000-yard stare, the term. So we've seen this phenomena of people who see horrible brutality or exposed to things that really um, uh, um, change their conception of life. They're often, the precise definition often involves the um, an occurrence of an event that actually almost led to the loss of their own life, right? So like being in a war zone where you are getting shot at, and your fear response is so great that you actually fear that you're about to die, and that physiological drive of fear and anxiety that is so severe that somehow, some way, it permanently alters the structure of your neural network, that then when you leave that scenario, you still carry the scars of that experience with you to a certain extent, and it creates phenomena of intrusive thoughts and memories of the exact same thing that you experienced, hypervigilance, always being worried that something like this can happen again, um, poor sleep, nightmares, very significant. And we see like soldiers who have a really hard time, reconnecting with the world. I mean, there's been so many movies in popular culture where the soldier is like this bitter person who comes back from a war and is unable to reconnect, right? And the idea of treating this within the conventional has always been, well, what are our answers from conventional medicine for anxiety and for depression? Has always been medications and perhaps maybe some talk therapy. Well, the truth is that if the condition arose from a mind-body complex, right, where the person's physiological reaction to a phenomena that they experienced is actually locking a neural structure in a way that actually gets them to repeat the same type of pattern, there should be a way to unlock the neural structure using the body in terms of as an extension of the mind to help to ease that. And what we found was acupuncture is such a therapy. You can use acupuncture to release the way in which the mind body holds its tension. And what we're finding now with more and more research that's being done on meditation, such as Richard Davidson's lab over at University of Wisconsin, is that the neuroplasticity of the brain to actually change itself um, must be taken into account when we're designing these therapies, to try to actually figure out a way to change the way in which a person's uh, um, response to the world is happening. And so the Army had become very interested in these things because they're very effective. They're very safe. The majority of them are very non-toxic. These approaches of integrative medicine, and everybody's favorite is they're very inexpensive. Everybody loves that, right? When it comes to medicine.
Yeah.
And so if you get that combination, effective, safe, cheap, wow, well, give me more, right? We want to have that in the Army. So this program came together, and the time there, it was extraordinary. We had a lot of challenges with trying to. So the program was not fully developed, and it was being developed as it was running. And so the program over at Fort Bliss ran into problems that are intrinsic to many other integrative medicine programs throughout the country. I have colleagues who worked at programs in academic centers, in health centers like professional health centers, and they, uh, uh, driven by Humana or over in Kaiser Permanente or over in Beth Israel Deaconess in New York. And these programs, you begin to have you find yourself running into the same brick wall that actually is a historical brick wall, in that there's a dichotomy in terms of what we think is actually appropriate for trying to come up with healing. What I mean by that is Western approaches are usually very much like it's you often don't see a doctor as often as you think you would need to, right? Some people will, you can see a Western medical doctor, we can once a year, we could adjust your medications and that's about it, because what it is that we're trying to treat and the way that we're trying to treat the person is almost based on this, fire and forget type of like approach to the medication. This medication, we give it to you, it should be doing what it's supposed to do for your chemistry in a way that actually is dependent upon the chemical, and you're going to have your response, right? And I learned and I trained in that, and I understand it. A lot of these Eastern and kind of integrative processes really require more visits, right? Really require a very hands-on approach to trying to, it's almost like sculpting the person's health back into place. They're very hands-on, whether it's acupuncture or chiropractic or hypnotherapy, it requires a whole lot more visits, right? And a whole lot more ways of trying to structure the medical encounter. So what we were having was challenges between the way in which the availability of the services. So, for example, acupuncture. To get really good outcomes, you got to see a patient maybe once a week, or 2 times a week, 3 times a week. Okay, now you got one doctor seeing a whole bunch of patients. Even if you try to max out the number and you're trying to make your acupuncture treatments as efficient as possible, you can only do 20, 30 treatments in a day, right? Or maybe that's even pushing it.
That
If you're
seems a
going to do,
lot. Yeah.
if you're going to do really good acupuncture,
Yeah.
where you're really trying to work on this person who has complex musculoskeletal imbalance, you're talking about, 15 people, 16, 18, 20 is like really hard to manage. Well, you have 30,000 troops on this base. So we're running into numbers that are, and the number of troops that have low back pain and neck pain and knee pain and etc. There's a lot. so
Yeah.
we
It's a
started
very
getting into,
physical career. It's a very physical
yeah.
career.
So we're getting into backup, right? We don't have the resources to provide. And then what happens is the administration doesn't seem to understand that what you need is actually more of these. To make a difference with these therapies, you need more of them. You can't have just one acupuncturist the same way you can have just one doctor.
Mm-hmm.
So this becomes, very challenging to work with. Well, my time with them was wonderful. I lasted a couple of years. I worked 2 years there as with Department of Defense, and for complex reasons, I was drawn over here to Tucson.
Mm-hmm.
My family was moving over, and we had a job opportunity over here with University of Arizona that we decided to take, and I got in contact with the VA. So fortunately, the VA here in Arizona was very receptive to my background, and they were very interested as well in trying to see if they could do things that also had integrative medicine. At the very beginning, there was not much. At the very beginning, I was assigned to a regular primary care clinic, which I was thankful for, to be able to work doing primary care. And within about 3 years' time of talking with people over at the main campus, I was able to continue to make myself my training known about my background in acupuncture, and they recruited me to go to be over at the main hospital to be part of an initiative that the VA now was doing, which is similar but not identical to that which the Department of Defense was doing. That's called the Whole Health Initiative. And I would, anybody who's watching this who has connection to the VA asking about whole health is incredible. The person who started the Whole Health Initiative or not started, but rather was the first director of the department of this, was Tracy Gaudet. So Dr. Tracy Gaudet was part of the first graduating class from the integrative medicine program here at the University of Arizona in Tucson, with Dr. Andrew Weil, like many years ago, right? So she then became she moved. Let's see. I don't remember what the chain of events were, but in any case, the interesting thing is that um, this program has embodied the same concepts that I've been following like this whole time. This idea of understanding the individual's healing as being dependent on many more factors of their life than just their medical numbers, right? You're not your disease. It's as has been said, the great dictum, the disease is not, it's not important what disease the patient has. It's the patient that it's important, that has the disease. And this concept of understanding that healing for a veteran must take place in terms of understanding their emotional health, their spiritual health, their nutritional health, are they sleeping well? These things, in terms of all these different factors, are now being seen as scientifically validated, right? There's a whole lot of research that's actually showing that much of what was understood in the ancient cultures in terms of giving rise to health is it's correct. Now we're of course not doing like all the things that the ancients did. We are taking the best of both worlds and trying to combine it. And now we're offering it to veterans. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, let me ask you this. Drawing on your experience, your story, and you shared a little bit of it here. I know more of it than what was shared here. When you're with a patient, when you're trying to figure out how to heal a patient,
Mm-hmm.
what have you learned, or what can you tell us about the world when you think about these three different points of views? The first point of view is that there's this God that exists, and that we do God's will, and that we live our lives subject to God's will, on the one hand. And then on the other hand, we have the view that is probably predominantly a Hindu view, but also a Buddhist view of this karma, in that we are subject to our past experiences and actions, and somehow we can't escape that. And then the third is your ability to determine what treatment to use, whether it be a pill or a procedure or a place that you put the needle in the body as you're doing an acupuncture treatment. And you can affect the way a person feels. Someone can walk in to your hospital with tremendous pain and walk out of there without that pain. How do you reconcile those 3 points of view? What is God's will? What is karma? And what is our ability to change the outcome of a person's life, including our own?
Oof. Dios mío. Wow. Carlos, that was here I was going on this direction, and this is that's a profound.
Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know that I have an answer. I can try my best to say that I'm uncertain that if I'm going to make a response, it's going to be based upon that which I have learned. And I have learned in this particular case, my answer would come from the Buddha. in that our teacher described some truths that did not need to be explained, right? There's many suttas or sutras that describe that Buddha himself emphasized the relief of suffering of sentient beings as being um, does not.
You had technical problems right when it was getting good. Let's see.
Let's see. You're there. Am I
Yeah.
back now? Because you're
Yeah.
moving now. I'm moving now.
Why don't you? Yeah. Why don't you? Let me propose the question again. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay,
Can you
good.
hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah.
So I guess the question that I'd asked you was that, taking into account your life story, and I know your life story quite well because we've been very good friends for so long. And part of the journey that you talked about was your journey from growing up in Laredo, Catholic, really believing the stories of your youth that you had grown up with. The challenge of facing all of that, when you went to Austin and seeking for more answers, and your introduction to Buddhism and Hinduism, and then later becoming a medical doctor. And so the question that I had is, when you look at if you look at you from 3 points of view, which is one, this idea of God's will, this, Catholic God and God's will, and put everything in God's hands, and God will take care of you. And then from the other point of view, this idea of karma, and that your actions, your words, the things that you do in life have a consequence, and you have to contend with the fact that everything you do will have a consequence. And then the idea that as a Western doctor who does integrative medicine, you have patients who come in and they are suffering from something, some ailment, some disease, and you're able to craft and identify treatments that changes the trajectory of their body, changes the trajectory of their life. The question is, how do you reconcile those 3 points of view? Can they be reconciled? Can they coexist with each other? Is one right? Are they all right? Is any of them wrong? And I wanted to hear from you, with your experience of treating these veterans and these combat soldiers who've come back with these very traumatic experiences, kind of what your view of that is.
Wow, that, Carlos, very profound, man. I this is why I enjoy hanging out, man. I wouldn't get a question like this from almost anybody.
I know. I'm famous for coming up with these questions in the bars. It's all my nights at bars.
Nice. I'm gonna come right back. I swear I'm gonna come back.
Yeah,
I didn't forget.
Go ahead.
But I have to tell you, because I've been wanting to tell you. Do you remember there was this one period in time we had just met, and you had literally, like, you had this look in your eye when you had this thing to tell me. He was like, I got something to tell you. I was like, what is it, man? You were like, okay, listen closely. The signifier has no signified. Do you remember that?
No, I don't remember that.
You don't remember that?
I don't remember that.
Holy moly. You were like, you for like weeks you went on with with describing about this statement, and then you were like, what does that mean to you, man? The signifier has no signified.
I probably read that in a book somewhere.
Yeah, it was something that really affected you profoundly, and you were reflecting on it over and over.
Well, that's been the journey. My journey has been that. My journey has been simply to, I guess I've really been trying to be authentic. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's like, man. Because for so long I didn't want to be authentic. I wanted to be what I thought I had to be to survive. And then, like, my journey came back this other way, and it's been like, well, what? And then the deeper question is, well, when do you know you're being authentic? You know what I mean? That's so hard to know. And so I guess when I talked about that, there was something in there that touched upon that idea, you know?
Well, you were deconstructing the world. I mean, that
Yeah.
concept right there, that statement is really like an attempt to
Yeah.
pull the facade away.
Yeah.
The signifier has no signified in actuality, right?
Yeah.
Life in terms of the terminologies that we use, it's all arbitrary. Everything is
Yeah.
created in a way that we think is solid, but it's not.
Yeah.
Um, and then coming back to your like that description of those questions, you know, um, I'm uncertain that I think that there needs to be an answer to know how to do good in the world. I mean, I don't think that you um, have to have an ultimate perspective to be able to still help people, right? So I'm uncertain that I have the answer. I mean, the Buddha himself described about how you know, the relief of suffering doesn't rely on us understanding the ultimate truths completely, right? The Buddha was asked, you know, is there a God? Is there no God? Is there both a God and no God? Is there? And he refused to answer, right? There's a famous sutra in which the Buddha would not answer questions about life after death and about heaven and about hell and et cetera and all these different things because it's inconsequential to actually the work that's in front of us, right? So he used it, he likened it to the story of the prince who was struck by an arrow in battle. The prince gets struck by an arrow in battle, and the doctor comes to save his life, and the prince says to him, wait, before you remove the arrow, I need to know what kind of an arrow is it? What kind of feathers are on it? Who actually shot it? Where did it come from? You know?
Mhm.
So like by the time all of these answers for like the questions about where the arrow that's stuck in his leg came from, who shot it, what, all of those, he'll be dead, right?
Mhm.
So the answer is like, pull out the arrow, fix the wound,
Mhm.
just do good in the world. You don't
Mhm.
necessarily have to have like a final answer as to whether they're your religion or this religion is right or wrong. You know, it's like, did the person who's in front of you have less suffering in their life? And it doesn't
Mhm.
just mean creating pleasure, right? Because then we'd all
Mhm.
be giving, you know, the like the opioid crisis is actually part
Mhm.
of that problem. Is actually
Mhm.
we're trying to like relieve people's suffering with a compound that actually ends up causing more
Yeah.
suffering, right? So
It's
it's like
horrible.
it's a very
Yeah.
complex circle of things. But in any case, the idea of you know, and karma is also. I mean, now I'm gonna get just ever so slightly into my Buddhist nerd, Buddhist geek approach of
Good.
way. So you know, as a Buddhist geek, the word karma is massively one of the least understood and poorly
Yeah.
translated words, right?
Yeah.
You know, and it ends up like being attributed very similarly to the concept of sin, right, or the
Mhm.
concept of some
Right.
form of retribution, right? This concept of like karma is a bitch, right, is really
Mhm.
known
Mhm.
well,
Mhm.
but it's that's not how it works. So if you
Mhm.
go into if you read carefully into the words of the great philosophers, you know, from it's a very different. It's not like driven by some form of divine justice. It's a very different concept and has a lot more to do with um, your own personal reality in terms of how you find yourself. Like you suffer within the construct of the mind that you place yourself in. So the karma that we reap is not one that's actually from external sources, like, you know, eventually ripening, but rather the way in which you project into the world that then makes you likely to have certain things happen to you or not. To oversimplify things, like if you get a very rough, abrasive person who goes into a scenario, the chances of them being treated roughly and abrasively is higher because of their personality and the way in which they're interacting with the world. Anyway, so that's kind of paraphrasing His Holiness the Dalai Lama, you know,
Mhm.
to say that karma is very different. But yeah, I meet a lot of veterans with very different backgrounds, right? Many of them are religious and do have viewpoints that are different than my own. And yet, my duty is to help them to be able to find relief from the suffering that they're experiencing, and to try to help them within the context of their own belief system as well. What I love now that I have grown past, understanding, I don't have this, I'm still very much a devout Buddhist, but it's no longer something that is at the exclusion of being able to have appreciation and respect for Catholicism. I have a deeper understanding now and much more respect for Catholicism as an institution in terms of its efforts to try to and its historical underpinnings, that it, where it came from.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that I love about Buddhist concept is that we see things not as solid, right? Every phenomena that occurs is part and parcel of those things that gave rise to it. And
Mm-hmm.
it actually is empty of an intrinsic existence on its own.
Mm-hmm.
There is no such thing as anything that actually has an existence of itself outside of those things that gave rise to it, right? There is nothing that you can find that is not somehow, some way interconnected to the rest of reality. And so now there is no exclusion of anybody or anything. I've been able to learn enough from this wisdom tradition to have had a significant reduction in my aversion to different viewpoints. I
Mm-hmm.
think that's supposedly, that's one of the signs of success, right? If you're supposedly supposed to be, one of the things that you're supposed to get if you're spiritual practice, right? A fruit of spiritual practice should be greater tolerance of others. It
Mm-hmm.
should be, right? We see that as a hallmark time and time again in every tradition, that the saints and sages that we see, one of the first things that they create in what they have is compassion for others and tolerance of others. And how can I say that I know what the hell I'm talking about if I'm not, if I don't end up becoming a person who actually has more compassion, And so compassion, I think, is the single most important um, endeavor of human life. And so I try my best when I work with patients to do so in a way that actually is going to improve their chances of being able to develop compassion also for themselves and for others. Um, and so that really has been my viewpoint, and is how I approach the care of veterans um, and patients and of everybody now. So I mean, I'd like to think so. At least a long way to go before it's
Yeah.
consistent,
Well,
but
compassion is very hard. I mean,
yeah.
it's like, I think the first impediment to compassion is judgment. It's
Mm,
like you judge yourself, you judge others, and you have your preconceptions of people and situations. And, by and large, it's wrong, and I feel like I have experienced the other side of that now with this border wall issue, because,
mm,
it's very difficult for me to turn on the television and see a Trump rally, or Trump or Trump supporters talking about we need a border wall. And I live in Laredo, and I mean, I'm telling you that if there was ever a place that there would be a need for a wall, if there was an actual need for a wall, it would be Laredo, because we're right across from Nuevo Laredo, which is one of the most dangerous northern Mexican cities today,
mm,
and we don't have the incidents of violence that you would think. And so if we don't have it, there's no way it could be worse somewhere else, right? And so, it's like that's really my first experience of being part of the other, a misunderstood, ill-conceived view of a group of people in a place. And then to see a policy developed around that ill-conceived, misinformed view that can have lasting effects against a group of people.
mm,
And
mm,
so, it's like then it takes me back to my own lack of compassion, right? My own judgment, and I've been struggling with that. And one of the places that I've struggled with that a lot in the last few days has been seeing a lot of these protesters who are going to state capitals fighting the um, stay-at-home orders, and they're
mm,
showing up with
mm,
a
mm,
lot from what is portrayed in the media. I'm not actually there, but what the images portrayed by the media is these angry white men in with rifles and camouflage, looking to do something. I don't know what, but that's what it looks like. And, again, initially judgment, they're wrong. This is, these are the same people that are the idiots that support this dumb border wall, and it's all stupid and it's terrible, and they're morons. And it's like, hold on a second, are you misunderstanding them as much as they're misunderstanding you?
Mm.
And I think that is the beginning of this journey of compassion, right?
Yeah, man, absolutely. I'm torn, between, um, ultimately they arise from causes and conditions, right? Whatever perspective they have and however they got to it, is arising from a cause and a condition.
Yeah.
And it's multifactorial, historical, deeply leveled inside of their where they're coming from. And so certainly we get nowhere by not having compassion. By having anger, we don't get anywhere. We make things worse, right?
Yeah.
And His Holiness the Dalai Lama by far has been, one of the most profoundly influential people on the planet, and for me personally. And he would certainly be a fan of dialogue, a fan of an advocate for trying to have an understanding, as opposed to a de facto, um, dismissal. Um, the Yeah, man. I mean, but I'm in the same boat. I have a very hard time. I do, when I'm faced with bigotry and xenophobia, and you see it for its destructive potential,
Mm-hmm.
and what is the right answer
Mm-hmm.
from us to try to face that and to say that that's wrong, and that is something that is potentially harmful for many people in the long term and for generations. And it's challenging to know what is the right way to approach that, in a way that is not self-aggrandizing or blind.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's a Yeah, but I struggle with that. I mean, we Tucson fortunately is extraordinarily progressive,
Mm-hmm.
which I'm very fortunate for. It mirrors a lot of the values that I grew up with in Laredo. That you know, Laredo being, although it has its very traditional roots, it's also very progressive in terms of its understanding of how many different how fluid the nature of life is, and it's very accepting in that nature. Um, and so here in Tucson, we have very, very similar, but I'm certainly surrounded by a whole lot more white people that are
Mm-hmm.
that are that have differing perspectives. Now, you
Yeah.
look at my complexion, you like point out, like, hey, Hernan, right? Like,
Yeah.
so me
Yeah.
parezco, o sea, I look white, like a
Yeah.
white guy. You would think
Yeah.
that my name is, something other than Rodrigo Ceballos, but
Yeah. Yeah.
and so I have had times where I have had patients or people talk to me, about those Mexicans, or about like, oh, this or that, and they talk to me as if I'm on their side, right? And they say things, they've revealed things to me. It's like that Eddie Murphy skit. You remember that one where he like paints himself like a white guy? Do you ever see that one?
No, I don't think I've
And he
seen it.
goes into like oh man, it's hilarious. If you can find on Saturday Night Live, he like puts
Yeah.
on makeup and he pretends to be a white dude with like a
Yeah.
mustache, and he like
Yeah.
goes in, and like he gets treated totally differently, like on the
Yeah.
bus and in the stores and everywhere he goes. And then so I have had that privilege, to
Yeah.
walk into spaces where people don't think that I'm Mexican American, and I have had people say things to me that until they know my name, and it's it's heartbreaking. I didn't see that until I left Laredo.
Yeah.
Once I left Laredo, I experienced it in Austin. I experienced it in,
Yeah.
not really heavily, but to a certain extent, I experienced it that also. Here in Tucson, I see it.
Mm-hmm.
Tucson is a border city. It's similar to Laredo, in that the border. used to be above Tucson, and then it passed down, right? The same way Laredo was created, and that Laredo was Mexico for a long time. Tucson was Spain, and then Mexico for a long time. And then the border past us, right? It then ended up going down and becoming Nogales. So now Nogales, Arizona is the actual border city, but Tucson still retains a lot of its Mexican-American heritage. But yeah, it's very challenging to see our country right now in this massive polarization is just I don't know. It's for I don't even know where to begin. Anyway.
Well, we could talk for hours. I mean, I could talk to you for you have topics for days. There's so much that we could go into. So I go so this would be a good ending point. But I want to thank you for taking the time this morning to talk to me. What has really impressed me about your journey, and to tie it back to the title of The Journey of the Soul, is that yet again, once again, is a person who takes who they were, the fundamentals of who they were, their upbringing, their background, the things that they were curious about. And, every step of the way, you did not know where you were headed, every step of the way, you did not know where you were headed. I can imagine going back to that little house that you lived in, when you first opened your clinic in Laredo, your acupuncture clinic in Laredo, hanging, I can just go back to that moment, one of those, warm Laredo evenings. And if I told you, Rodrigo, 22 years from now, you're going to be living in Tucson, Arizona, you're going to be a medical doctor, you're going to be practicing integrative medicine, you're going to be helping military veterans, and you're going to be using all of the things that you learned, to help them, to give them a measurable difference in their day-to-day lives. You would have said, probably you would not have believed that. And yet here you are, and so to me, it's just an amazing thing. It's like nothing that we go through is wasted. All of it feels like it's preparation for something else, including this moment, So I want to thank you, Rodrigo, for taking the time to visit with me. And I look forward to having more conversations with you in this format, on other topics, because I know you have so many different things that you can share about.
Thank you, Carlos. Thank you. That is it's been wonderful. It's been an honor to see you again, man. You were on my mind. I had wanted to, and then who would have also known that when I thought to reach out to check in how my good old friend is doing, that I would end up on a podcast, on a video, like
on a YouTube channel.
On a YouTube channel.
Yeah.
Like I'm thankful that this happened. This has been very enjoyable, man. Thank you for letting me talk and recap my life here, and it's this is very different. So I appreciate it.
Let me go ahead and end the show, and then hold back for just a second, okay?
Okay, órale. Okay.
Give me 1 second.
Okay, thank you.